Don't you dare ignore me when I am speaking to you. You are responsible for this mess, and you will fix it.
You spend all day sitting at home carrying the child.
You don't earn a single penny.
And you still dare to speak up at this dinner table?
I work 12 hours a day to support this entire family.
And what have you actually done, other than constantly complaining that the child is sick and in pain?
Other people work all day and still manage to take care of their children. Why does everything become such a huge problem when it comes to you?
He said, those words right in front of his mother, right in front of his little daughter lying in bed with a fever. His voice was not lowered. There was no hesitation. It was as if it were an obvious truth that everyone should nod and agree with. He did not know. Or perhaps he knew, but had never allowed himself to think about it. That the woman he had just belittled in this very house was the only person carrying the weight that kept it from falling apart day after day. She was the one who woke up at 3 in the morning when their daughter went into convulsions from a high fever. She was the one who remembered the exact medication schedule, dosage, and side effects. She was the one who called a private doctor when the public hospital refused to accept any more patients. She was the one who quietly cut back on her own meals to save money for a specialized formula that insurance would not cover. Some sacrifices are so silent that people only realize their value after they are gone, and this is the story of a woman who chose to disappear in exactly that sense. Her name was Hoi An. Hoi An was not always a woman confined within 4 walls, surrounded by the smell of medicines and the sound of heart monitors. Before her daughter, little Me, was diagnosed with a rare immune disorder at the age of 3, Hoi An had been the head of a design team at a well-known media company in the city. She had stood on stage, receiving an award for outstanding young professionals. She had been the person her colleagues jokingly called the mind that never runs out of ideas. She met Kwang Hui, her husband now, at a project launch party. At the time, he was a sales manager, confident in conversation, quick to laugh, and skilled at making people feel important. They fell in love quickly, and with certainty, there was no drama, no turbulence. After 2 years, they moved in together, and not long after that, Me was born. At that time, everything looked like a picture painted exactly according to what people are taught a successful life should be. A house, a car, a child, promising careers, a husband who knew how to earn money, a wife who knew how to manage a family. None of them, including Hoi An, had ever imagined a morning in October when little Me suddenly could not get out of bed, her skin pale, her lips turning blue, while the emergency room doctor looked at them with the kind of expression that warned them nothing would ever be the same again. The diagnosis came after 3 weeks of continuous testing. It was a long unfamiliar disease name that Hoi An had to look up repeatedly just to pronounce correctly. It was an illness with no permanent cure. It could only be controlled through a strict treatment plan, constant monitoring, and the reality that any small mistake in daily routines, diet, or living conditions could push Miss Fragile body into a critical condition. The doctor spoke plainly to them in the consultation room that day. Their daughter needed a full-time caregiver, not the kind of care given casually after work in the evening. She needed someone constantly present, monitoring every indicator, every small change on her skin, every unusual breath she took while sleeping that night. The couple sat in their car in the hospital parking lot for a long time without saying a word. In the end, it was Hoi An who spoke first. She said that she would quit her job. At that time, Kwang Hui did not object. In fact, he held her hand and said that he would work harder to make up for the lost income. He said it was the right decision. He said they would get through it together. Back then, those words sounded like a promise made out of love. None of them knew that over time it would slowly turn into a weapon. During the first 5 months after Hoi An quit her job, everything still maintained a fragile balance. Kwang Hui still asked about me every evening, still spent weekends taking their daughter to follow-up appointments with his wife, still held Hoi An's hand on nights when his high fever sent them rushing to the emergency room in the middle of the night, but gradually the pace of his work increased. Meetings stretched later into the evening. Business trips away from home became more frequent. Along with that came a very small change, almost impossible to notice at first, in the way he viewed his wife's days. He began to see Hoe and staying at home as something natural, as an extended period of rest, rather than a real job that demanded more alertness and endurance than any management position she had ever held. He no longer sincerely asked how Mi was doing that day. Instead, he asked out of routine, his eyes fixed on his phone screen while listening to the answer. Sometimes he would not even listen to the entire response before changing the subject. There were evenings when he came home and found the house messier than usual, because Hoi-an had spent the entire afternoon monitoring every drop of medication being administered to their daughter. He would frown. He never said it directly, but his expression said enough. What had she been doing all day for the house to look like this? Hoi-an's mother-in-law, Mrs. Tam, only widened that distance week after week. She had never liked Hoi-an from the beginning. She believed her son deserved a wife who knew how to take care of a family. And the fact that Hoi-an had once had her own career and been praised by society was, in Mrs. Tam's eyes, a sign that she did not know her place. When Hoi-an quit her job to care for me, Mrs. Tam did not see it as a sacrifice. Instead, she saw it as confirmation of what she had always believed. That in the end, her daughter-in-law should simply stay home and fulfill the role of a woman. Yet even then, she was not satisfied every time she visited. She would sit on the sofa, look around the living room, and make comments that sounded light but cut like knives. She would say that back in her day, she had raised 3 children while working in the fields and taking care of the house without hiring any help, yet she still managed everything perfectly. Or she would remark that little Mi looked too pale, probably because she was not getting enough nutrition, implying that Hoi-an did not know how to care for her daughter properly. Not once did she ask Hoi-an if she was tired. Not once did she ask whether she was getting enough sleep. Not once did she offer to help for even a single afternoon so Hoi-an could rest. In her eyes, her daughter-in-law's hardship was simply expected. It was not worth mentioning, let alone recognizing. Hoi-an was not someone who did not know how to fight back. In the beginning, she had tried to explain. She had tried to tell her husband what a typical day actually looked like. Waking up at 5 in the morning to check M's temperature. Preparing medications according to a strict schedule. Monitoring the symptom charts the doctor required her to keep. Spending afternoons arguing with health insurance providers about medication coverage. Enduring nights with almost no sleep because Mi kept waking up from pain. But the responses she received were usually little more than indifferent acknowledgements, or worse, comparisons. Other people had sick children too. Why did she have to make such a big deal out of everything? Gradually, Hoi-an learned that explaining only exhausted her without changing anything. So she chose silence, not because she was weak, but because she had begun to understand something. Some people will never see the value of something until it is no longer beside them. And the night Kwang Hui made that remark in front of his mother and their feverish daughter lying in bed was the night something inside Ho and quietly closed. There was no drama, no tears, just a door shutting softly but decisively, as if she had been waiting for one final sign to know that she no longer needed to prove anything to this man. At Kwang Hui's birthday party, that year nearly 20 friends gathered at their house. Hoi-an had just finished preparing the meal and sat down for barely 5 minutes when Tuan, one of Kwang Hui's co-workers, asked whether she was still doing design work these days. Before she could answer, Kwang Hui burst out laughing and slapped his friend on the shoulder. My wife changed careers, he joked. She is a full-time stay-at-home professional now, wakes up, handles meals, watches movies in the afternoon, waits for her husband to come home at night. What more could she possibly want? The entire table erupted in laughter. Someone even joked that Kwang Hui was lucky. No one knew that earlier that afternoon, she had been cooking while monitoring Miss Medication's schedule. She had run into her daughter's room 3 times to check her temperature. She had taken a phone call from the doctor in the middle of everything to confirm blood test results. She simply smiled politely. She did not correct him. because she knew any explanation would only sound like complaining in front of guests. Outside the home, Kwang Hui was a successful man, trusted by his superiors, receiving steady raises and bonuses, and that success gradually became the only standard he used to measure other people, including his own wife. In his mind, an unspoken comparison took shape. Chuan-S wife still worked despite having 2 young children. Long-S wife from the engineering department had managed to open an online store. Meanwhile, his wife stayed at home all day and earned nothing. He never calculated how much a private nurse for me would cost each month. He never thought about who would be the first person to notice an abnormal symptom before it became life-threatening to him. Caring for a sick child was simply a form of rest disguised as busyness. One day he posted a family photo celebrating their wedding anniversary when friends jokingly asked in the comments whether his wife planned to return to work. He publicly replied, leaving the comment visible for both families to read, "Probably not. She has gotten too used to the easy life at home if she had to go back to work now." She'd probably cry. The comment received dozens of laughing reactions. Some of them came from Hoyan-S own friends. She saw the post almost immediately after it went up. She scrolled through it, paused for a long moment, then turned off her phone without replying, without deleting anything, and went back to the thermometer tucked under her daughter's arm. Mrs. Tam, her mother-in-law, only made the imbalance worse. Every time she visited, she never asked whether her daughter-in-law was tired. She simply observed and made comments aimed directly at Hwai and S efforts. Seeing the house slightly messy because Hoi An had just spent hours dealing with one of Mia's full-body rash outbreaks, Mrs. Tam shook her head and said to her son right in front of Hoi An, "My poor son, you got married and still, no one keeps the house clean. Let your mother come help." Then she proceeded to rearrange things. Hoi An had carefully organized according to the sanitation procedures doctors had prescribed for a child with a weakened immune system. Not once did Kwang Hui speak up for his wife. He simply laughed awkwardly, sometimes even nodding in agreement with his mother, and so it continued. Layer by layer, not through one great shock, but through hundreds of small cuts repeated every day, until Hoi An almost stopped feeling pain in the old wounds. All that remained was a familiar numbness, swallowing every hurt just to keep this household peaceful for one more day, several months after Kwang Hui's birthday party. Hoi An began learning front-end programming at night. After Mi had taken her medication and fallen asleep, she would open her old laptop, follow free online courses, and struggle through basic lines of code one by one. She realized her old design skills were becoming outdated, and if there ever came a day when she needed to stand on her own, she could not afford to start from nothing. She told no one about it. Not because she was hiding it, but because she knew that if she mentioned it, the only response she would receive would be a sarcastic remark about having too much free time. At the same time, she was the first person to notice something unusual in Mi's latest lab results. One liver enzyme indicator had risen slightly, something the primary physician had overlooked while handling too many patients at once. Hoi and read medical literature on her own, compared the results with Maya's treatment plan, then proactively requested a different doctor and demanded additional specialized testing. The results later proved she was right. One of MES medications was showing signs of causing liver damage if continued long-term. The new doctor had to revise the entire treatment plan. It was a discovery that may very well have saved her daughter from a serious future complication. But when she told Kwang Hu about it that evening, hoping for some acknowledgement, he merely glanced up from his phone screen and said, "Well, that's a mother's job. Anyone taking care of a child should notice things like that." Then he looked back down and continued answering work messages. Not a single follow-up question, not a single word of thanks. As if preventing his daughter from suffering permanent liver damage were just another ordinary household task, no different from cooking dinner on time. The breaking point came during the family gathering at the end of the year, when both sides of the family met at Mrs. Tam's house for the annual year-end meal. During dinner, one of Kwang Hui's uncles, a construction company director, jokingly asked whether Hoi An planned to return to work to help ease Kwang Hui's burden, since everyone had heard that Mai's medical expenses were far from cheap. Hoa An was about to answer politely that she was continuing her studies so she could eventually work remotely. But before she could speak, Kwang Hui answered for her. There was a little alcohol in his voice, a little frustration accumulated from an exhausting work week. In front of more than 20 family members, he said bluntly, "What work is she going to do? She's been living off me for years and got used to it. If you threw her back out into society now, she probably wouldn't survive a month. The only thing she's good at is spending the money I earn." The entire table fell silent for a second. Then someone laughed awkwardly to ease the tension. Someone else lowered their head and pretended to pick up food just to avoid looking at Hoi An. And Mrs. Tam, sitting right beside him, did not defend her daughter-in-law. She merely sighed softly as if she agreed. Then she added, "Well, men speak bluntly sometimes. A daughter-in-law should understand her husband." Hoi An sat there, her chopsticks steady in her hand. Her face did not change. She did not argue. She did not get up and leave. Not a single tear fell in front of the 20 people watching her dignity being publicly trampled. She simply finished her meal in silence, thanked everyone, and excused herself early because Mi seemed tired. On the drive home, Mi had already fallen asleep in the back seat. Hoi An stared out the window as streetlights passed across her face one after another. In her mind, Kwang Hui's words kept repeating, not in a way that caused more pain. But in a strange way, they felt like a final confirmation of something she had quietly suspected for a very long time. This man would never see her value, as long as she remained standing in one place trying to prove it. Anyone listening to this story who has ever lived through a similar moment, who has ever been humiliated by the very person they trusted most while no one stepped forward to defend them, will understand that some humiliations do not need shouting to hurt. They hurt in silence, the kind of hurt that suddenly makes everything clearer than it has ever been before, so clear that there is no room left for illusion. That night, after putting Mai to bed and checking her temperature one last time, Hoi An sat down at the small desk in the corner of the room where she had secretly studied every night. She wrote a short note. No accusations, no long explanations, just one sentence. "I'm taking Inki to stay with my parents for a while. You don't need to look for us." She placed it on the dining table. Then she packed a few sets of clothes for herself and her daughter into a suitcase. She left the house that very night. No noisy taxi, no phone calls, no advance notice to anyone. Just quietly, the same way she had lived for years. The difference was that this time, the silence was a decision, not endurance. The small house in her hometown, where Hoi An's mother had lived alone since her father passed away, became the place where the two of them started over. No one in this new neighborhood knew that Hoi An had once been an award-winning design team leader. No one knew she had stood on stage, accepting professional awards to them. She was simply a young woman with a frequently ill little daughter, renting a small room near the district hospital for easier access to regular checkups. She took freelance design jobs through online platforms. At first, they were only small projects, a few $100,000 for a logo design, a promotional banner. She worked during the rare moments when we were asleep or attending part-time classes at a nearby preschool where the teachers understood her special medical condition. Some nights she slept only 3 hours. She woke early to prepare medication for her daughter, then sat down at her desk and worked until sunrise. But this time, no one stood beside her, making sarcastic remarks about what she did all day. No one compared her to other people. There was only her and a growing number of clients month after month. The turning point came through a client named Lan, the owner of a small cosmetic store chain, who wanted to completely rebuild her brand image. At first, she hired Hoi An for only a few individual design projects, but after seeing how she worked careful, reliable, always meeting deadlines, listening closely, and delivering solutions beyond expectations, Lan asked her directly whether she would be interested in managing the entire long-term branding strategy for the company. During their first in-person meeting, Lan casually asked about Huai and S family situation. Huai briefly explains that she was raising her daughter alone and mentioned Miss S' illness. Not to complain, just as an honest answer. Lan, who had also raised 2 children alone after her divorce, looked at her for a moment and said, "I see something in you that many professional designers don't have patience, the ability to notice every tiny detail. I'm guessing that comes from taking care of a sick child." Does it? That is something no one can teach, and no amount of money can buy it. That sentence, simple and accidental, was the first time in many years that someone had recognized exactly what Howe Ann had been carrying in silence all along, that those years of being dismissed as doing nothing had actually forged in her a level of attentiveness, observation, and perseverance that no school could ever teach. From that project onward, Howe Ann's name began circulating among small business owners in the area. Clients came through referrals, and within just 1 year, she was able to hire a part-time assistant and open a small office of her own at home, earning enough to cover all of Maya's medical expenses without depending on anyone else meanwhile. Life in the old house was far from as smooth as Kwang Hui had imagined when he convinced himself that losing Hoi An would not matter during the first few weeks after she left. He maintained a stubborn attitude, believing she was merely upset and would eventually return. But when the house began falling into disorder because no one cleaned it properly, when he had to manage everything himself, when work started suffering because he could no longer focus, things changed. The meetings he once handled effortlessly became awkward. His manager noticed that his performance had clearly declined over several consecutive months. Mrs. Tam, who had once viewed Ho's departure as a relief, also began realizing something. The family meals were no longer complete. Kwang Hee was visibly losing weight. The house that once echoed with a child's laughter now felt unbearably silent every time she visited. One day, while talking with a neighbor, she casually remarked, "Hai has looked so worn out lately. I guess he is missing someone to take care of him," without realizing it. That sentence was a belated admission of something she had never allowed herself to consider before, that Y and S presence in that house had never been as meaningless as she had once believed. 1 year after Hoyan quietly walked away, her life had completely transformed. The small design office she started now had its own workspace and several employees. Clients arrived in increasing numbers, giving her and me a stable life without needing anyone's support. Most importantly, me was healthier. Hospital visits became less frequent. Color had returned to the little girl's cheeks, and her smile, a smile Hoyan once feared she might never see again, had come back as well. Every evening, mother and daughter sat together at dinner, sharing small stories from their day. Only then did Ho An truly understand what peace looked like. Meanwhile, news of her success gradually reached old acquaintances. Not because Ho An bragged about it, but because her name began appearing in conversations about business and entrepreneurship. A short article about a single mother raising a sick child while building a successful career eventually reached Mrs. Tam for the first time in many years. She did not respond with criticism. She simply sat in silence, as though facing a truth she had deliberately avoided seeing for far too long. As for Kwang Hee, life did not unfold the way he had expected. His career declined. A series of mistakes cost him the position he once held. The house that had always felt warm and orderly became cold and empty. Many nights he sat alone, looking through old photographs of his wife and daughter. For the first time in his life, he began wondering whether the person he had always taken for granted had truly been as insignificant as he once believed. Then one weekend afternoon, while Hoi An was finishing a major client project, her phone suddenly rang. The caller was a nurse from a hospital. Kwang Hui had been admitted due to severe exhaustion. In his emergency contact records, the only name still listed was Hoyan. She froze for a few seconds. After a year without contact, she never expected to hear his name this way. That evening, after asking her mother to watch me, Hoyan went to the hospital. Not because she was still in love, not because she wanted to return, but because she had never been the kind of person who could abandon someone in a difficult moment. Standing outside the hospital rooms, she saw Kwang Hee lying in bed. He looked far more gaunt than she remembered. Beside him sat Mrs. Tam in silence. When she saw Hosen, Mrs. Tam quickly stood up. For the first time in years, there was no contempt or coldness in her eyes. Her voice trembled. You came, thank you. He's been delirious with fever for days. He keeps calling your name. Huian did not answer immediately. She simply looked through the glass window at the man who had once publicly humiliated her, who had made her believe she was worthless. Now he lay there weak and alone. In that moment, Hoi An understood something. This unexpected phone call had not come to bring her back to the past. It was simply the final test that allowed her to see how far she had come. The woman who had quietly left with a single suitcase a year ago was now strong enough to face everything, without resentment, without needing to prove anything to anyone. When Kwang Hui woke up and saw Huai An standing outside the hospital room, his eyes immediately filled with tears. He was no longer the confident man who had once mocked his wife in front of friends. He had grown noticeably thinner. His face was worn by months of exhaustion and pressure. He stared at her for a long time before softly saying the words he should have spoken years ago. I am sorry. The room suddenly became strangely quiet. Mrs. Tam, sitting beside him, lowered her head. The pride and harshness she once carried were gone. Slowly, Kwang Hui explained that only after Huai An left had he understood that the life he had always taken for granted had actually been built upon her silent sacrifices. The warm meals, the sleepless nights caring for me, the times she noticed warning signs and rushed their daughter to the hospital, the paperwork, the countless small household tasks, all of it disappeared the day she walked out that door. He admitted that he had lost many things during the past year. Not only his position at work, not only the stability of his life, he had lost the one person who had always quietly stood behind him, carrying burdens without asking for anything in return. His voice broke as he confessed that he had been wrong for a very long time, and he had realized it far too late, looking at Huai An as though clinging to his final chance. He asked whether she could give him one more opportunity. Hoi An stood quietly. She looked at the man before her, the man who had hurt her again and again, the man who had publicly humiliated her in front of family, friends, and colleagues, the man who had made her doubt her own worth. But what surprised her most was that she no longer felt angry. The wounds from those years no longer had the power to hurt her heart again. She smiled gently and spoke in a calm voice. Sometimes, while something is still beside us, we think it has no value at all. Only after losing it do we realize how much we depended on it. Kwang Hui lowered his head and clenched his hands tightly. Hoyan looked at him for another moment before continuing. Back then you always thought, I only stayed at home, only took care of our daughter, only did things that anyone could do. But those seemingly ordinary things kept this family together for many years. She paused for a few seconds. Now that you understand that, it's enough. No blame, no sarcasm, no satisfaction. That calmness hurt Kwang Hee more than any criticism ever could. He understood that the woman standing before him had traveled too far to return to the place that had once wounded her. Ho An placed the bouquet on the table and gently wished him a speedy recovery. She told him that Mi still needed a healthy father in her life, but that did not mean everything could go back to the way it was. Then she turned and walked out of the hospital room. Outside in the hallway, the last rays of sunlight stretched across the tiled floor, and her grandmother were waiting for her at the end of the corridor. The moment the little girl saw her mother, she immediately ran forward and threw her arms around her. Hoi An bent down and held her daughter close. Feeling the small warmth she had fought so hard to protect through the most difficult years of her life, she knew she did not need any more apologies. Nor did she need to prove her worth to anyone. Her life now was the clearest answer of all. As the 3 generations walked out of the hospital together, Hoi An never looked back. Behind her were the wounds, the years of being underestimated, and a marriage that had come to an end. Ahead of her was a new life she had built with her own resilience. And sometimes the greatest victory is not making the people who hurt you regret what they did. It is living so happily that those old wounds no longer have the power to affect your life. If Hoyan's story made you think, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.